I've spent months digging through declassified files, forgotten news archives, and eyewitness accounts that were never meant to see the light of day. What I found shocked me. There's a story, a horrifying, almost shameful truth that connects two of the most haunting disasters in space history, Apollo 1 and a man the world was never supposed to know, Valentin Bondarenko. Before America's tragedy, there was another fire, one that burned in silence, erased from records, hidden behind steel doors and government lies. And when you realize how similar these two events were, how one could have prevented the other, it'll change the way you look at space exploration forever. This is not just about rockets or heroes, it's about secrets, about pride, and about the human cost of silence. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the most dangerous thing in space wasn't the vacuum, it was the truth itself. If you love uncovering stories history tried to erase, hit subscribe, leave a comment about what shocked you most, and don't forget to like this video. It helps more people discover what really happened. Now, let's begin. It all started long before the first spacecraft touched the black silence above the Earth. Before the photographs of smiling astronauts and parades with waving flags, there was something quieter, almost invisible. The era of space exploration began not with triumphs, but with the silent hum of machinery, the hiss of pressurized air, and the stubborn will of those who believed that reaching the stars was worth any risk. In the early 1960s, both the Soviet Union and the United States were racing against time, and perhaps against common sense. Every second mattered, every experiment had the taste of urgency. The laboratories smelled of metal, oil, and ozone, a strange perfume of ambition. Young men were stepping into chambers and capsules, trusting the engineers, trusting equations that still trembled with uncertainty. They were not just preparing for space, they were walking into the unknown, willingly. No one really knew what would happen to the human body in space. Could a heart keep its rhythm in weightlessness? Would the mind endure the silence, the isolation, the endless hum of machinery? The scientists speculated, but speculation was never enough. They needed proof, and proof always came with a price. Behind every celebrated launch, there were countless small tests, pressure chambers, oxygen enclosures, heat simulations, each one a potential trap disguised as progress. The people inside those rooms were pioneers in the purest sense. They were explorers of the invisible, the edge between life and the void. History tends to celebrate the moments of victory, the first steps, the planted flags, the grand speeches. But before those, there were hidden stories written in the language of risk and error. Some names disappeared from records, erased by politics or fear. Others were never spoken aloud, as if saying them might weaken the illusion of perfection that surrounded the space race. It is easy to forget that space exploration was at its core a human story, fragile, uncertain, full of mistakes. Every spark, every miscalculation could become a lesson or a warning. Some were learned too late. The early years of the space age were a paradox, a time of glory and silence, discovery and denial. Beneath the bright headlines, the cost of knowledge was quietly being counted in laboratories where metal doors closed with a heavy echo, and the world outside would never know what truly happened inside. He was not supposed to become a symbol. Valentin Bondarenko was simply one of many, a face among the first 20 young men chosen to train for humanity's most daring experiment. He was small in stature, almost fragile compared to the steel and concrete world that surrounded him, but his eyes had that particular spark, the quiet fire of someone who never doubted why he was there. Born in Kharkiv in 1937, he grew up in a country still recovering from war, where dreams were a luxury. Yet even as a boy, he loved the sky, not in the poetic sense, but with a kind of technical fascination. He built model airplanes from scraps of tin, drew engines on the back of school notebooks, and listened to the drone of real aircraft with an intensity that others found strange. When he spoke about flight, it wasn't about romance or heroism, it was about precision. He wanted to understand how things worked, how man could rise above gravity and stay there. By the time he joined the cosmonaut training program in 1960, Bondarenko was already an accomplished pilot, known for his composure under pressure. He didn't drink much, didn't boast, and rarely raised his voice. His fellow trainees called him the Quiet One. He smiled often, but his humor was subtle, almost invisible unless you listened carefully. It wasn't ambition that drove him, not in the competitive sense. It was curiosity, and maybe something deeper, a desire to prove that ordinary men could touch the impossible. Training in those early days was nothing like the sleek, organized image the world would later see. It was raw, experimental, improvised. Machines broke, instructions changed overnight, and every test seemed to carry an unspoken question. How far could the human body go before it broke? Valentin approached it all with an engineer's calmness. When others complained about the long isolation tests or the constant noise of compressors, he took notes. He wanted to learn. He always wanted to learn. Colleagues remembered him as someone who carried light with him, not the kind that burns, but the kind that steadies others. He never sought attention, never imagined his name would be remembered for anything tragic. In those narrow corridors of the training facility, where the air smelled of rubber and disinfectant, he was just another man preparing for flight, believing in the quiet miracle of progress. No one, not even he, could have guessed that one ordinary training day would later become a cautionary echo across two nations, linking his name with another fire, another set of astronauts, and a lesson humanity would learn the hardest way possible. The training facility sat at the edge of the city, surrounded by pines that swayed in the dry wind. It didn't look like a place where history would be made, more like an industrial outpost, with peeling paint, low buildings, and a smell of machine oil that never left your clothes. Inside, corridors stretched endlessly, echoing with the metallic clang of boots and the steady thump of pumps that kept the pressure chambers alive. It was here that a generation of young men prepared to leave Earth, though few ever saw the sky beyond the narrow windows of the training compound. The chambers themselves were remarkable in their simplicity, large, cylindrical containers of thick metal with small glass ports like eyes staring into nothing. Inside them, the air was thick, artificially enriched with oxygen, a reminder that even breathing could become a controlled experiment. The goal was to simulate isolation, to test how long a person could endure physical confinement, psychological monotony, and the mechanical hum that filled every second of the day. When the door closed, the world outside ceased to exist. Time stretched. There were no clocks inside, no external signals, just a clipboard of procedures and a voice crackling through the intercom. "How are you feeling?" they would ask. And every trainee gave the same answer, even if it wasn't true. Fine. Because in those early days, admitting fatigue or fear wasn't an option. Bondarenko treated each session as a puzzle. He observed how his own body changed, how the air felt thinner, how his heartbeat adjusted to the environment, how the mind began to wander in circles when there was nothing left to focus on. He recorded it all, line by line, in neat handwriting. His notes weren't dramatic, they were methodical. You could almost sense the patience between the words. He was trying to understand, not to endure. The chamber technicians, dressed in gray overalls, watched through narrow observation windows. Their hands moved across dials and switches, adjusting temperature, pressure, humidity, the invisible elements that separated comfort from collapse. Most of them were young too, engineers and medics barely out of university. They joked quietly during breaks, but when the red lights above the chamber door flickered on, the laughter stopped. It was a place of precision, not emotion. The environment demanded discipline. One wrong move, a spilled drop of alcohol, a spark, a forgotten switch, could undo everything. The air, so pure and safe in theory, was also treacherous. It clung to fabric, skin, hair. It turned the smallest mistake into something irreversible. Yet no one truly feared it. They believed in the system, in the careful hands of science. There was a strange beauty in that place, a fragile balance between control and chaos. The metal walls held the breath of a nation chasing the future, one controlled inhale at a time. And somewhere inside that humming maze, Valentin Bondarenko sat quietly, unaware that his meticulous calmness, his faith in procedure, would soon collide with the one element no equation could predict: chance. It was supposed to be an ordinary training day, the kind that began with the usual briefing, the same white coats, the same scent of antiseptic hanging in the air. Outside, the March wind carried a chill through the courtyard, lifting dry leaves against the concrete walls. Inside, everything followed routine: checklists, nods, silence. The world felt mechanical, predictable. Nothing hinted that this day would mark a before and after in the story of human spaceflight. Bondarenko arrived early, as he always did. His uniform was clean, neatly pressed, his notebook tucked under his arm. Technicians prepared the chamber. Oxygen levels adjusted, equipment tested, seals inspected. It was a controlled environment, designed for observation, not danger. No one paid much attention to the small alcohol burner used for sterilizing instruments. It had been there for months, unremarkable, part of the background noise of training. The test began at noon. The hatch closed with its familiar metallic click, followed by the low hum of compressors pressurizing the chamber. Bondarenko settled into his seat, attached sensors to his chest, and began filling out his medical log. The air inside was heavy, pure oxygen, clean but strangely suffocating. Through the small glass window, the observers saw him moving methodically, calm as ever. Hours passed. The chamber lights cast a sterile glow, flattening every shadow. Bondarenko, fatigued but focused, reached for a cotton ball soaked in alcohol to clean an electrode pad. A simple, thoughtless gesture. Somewhere nearby, the small electric stove still glowed faintly from its last use. No one inside or outside noticed the moment the cotton made contact. A spark, barely visible, jumped in the oxygen-thick air. And then, light. Too bright, too fast. Fire in an oxygen environment doesn't behave like ordinary fire. It doesn't flicker, it consumes. The flames leapt across the chamber walls in an instant, feeding greedily on every fiber, every molecule. Through the window, the technicians froze. They could see him moving, trying to smother the flames, instinctively, desperately. The radio filled with static. Inside, the pressure difference made the hatch impossible to open. The air outside was normal, the air inside, deadly. They shouted, scrambled, turned valves, but the metal refused to yield. Seconds turned into minutes. The roaring inside the chamber dulled, replaced by a suffocating silence. When they finally managed to equalize the pressure and open the door, the air burst outward with a hiss that seemed to echo endlessly. Smoke drifted into the corridor, acrid and unreal. Bondarenko was still conscious when they reached him. He tried to speak. No one could hear the words. They lifted him out carefully, as though any sudden movement might undo what little was left holding him together. The medics worked quickly, instinctively, but the smell of burnt oxygen clung to everything. Outside, the wind still moved through the pine trees. The world continued, unaware that inside a gray building, history had just shifted. The Soviet space program would move forward, stronger, more secretive, more cautious. But behind every future success, there would always linger the memory of that moment when fire bloomed in a sealed room and time, for a breathless instant, stopped. Fire behaves differently when it has no reason to stop. In normal air, a flame hesitates, it dances, feeds, retreats. But in pure oxygen, it becomes something else entirely. It's no longer a flicker, no longer an element to control. It's hunger in its purest form. The training chamber that day was filled with exactly that. An invisible sea of potential energy waiting for a single imperceptible spark. The irony was brutal. The same oxygen that symbolized life, progress, and human endurance became the agent of destruction. Inside the chamber, every surface, every thread, every molecule was saturated with it. Cotton, metal, even skin carried more oxygen than the designers had ever imagined. No one thought of it as dangerous. It was clean, efficient, predictable. Science had decided it was safe. Until it wasn't. When the flame erupted, it consumed everything in seconds. The wool suit, chosen for comfort, became an accelerant. The air itself turned hostile. The sound of fire in such an environment isn't a crackle, it's a roar, a kind of deep, mechanical thunder that devours air faster than a person can breathe. There's no time to think, no moment to react. It's over almost as soon as it begins. From a technical point of view, the event was a chain reaction. From a human point of view, it was chaos. Instruments melted, sensors failed, cables fused to the walls. The temperature inside the chamber spiked beyond measurement. Outside, the technicians struggled to make sense of the data streaming in through the control panel. Meaningless numbers, alarms flashing without explanation. The oxygen that had promised precision now offered only confusion. Later analyses would describe the chemistry, how heat accelerated oxidation, how the wool ignited, how the alcohol vapor amplified the reaction. But in that moment, it wasn't science, it was instinct. The technicians banged on the hatch, shouting for him, knowing he couldn't hear. Pressure gauges trembled. The metal walls expanded under the heat, groaning as if alive. When the fire finally choked itself out, the oxygen was gone, burned away, replaced by the thick, suffocating residue of what used to be air. It left behind silence, the kind of silence that settles after something irreversible has happened. There was no villain in this story, no malice, no sabotage, only physics and the terrible precision of circumstance. A cotton ball, a stove, a moment's distraction, and a system designed without forgiveness. The Soviet engineers would later learn the same lesson the Americans would confront years later with Apollo 1, that oxygen, when confined and pure, has no mercy for human error. It was an age of discovery, yes, but also of naivety, a time when technology was worshipped and faith in progress sometimes blinded even the wisest minds. The fire didn't only consume a man, it burned away illusions. It revealed that every advancement, no matter how noble, carries a shadow. And in that gray building, behind sealed doors, the shadow had finally taken form, bright, furious, and unforgettable. Panic has a strange texture. It moves in waves, distorts time, turns seconds into something elastic and cruel. The moment the red alarm lights flashed in the control room, everything that had once been routine became chaos. The technicians reacted almost automatically. Years of drills and procedures had trained them to move fast, but nothing in the manuals had prepared them for this. They could see the fire through the narrow observation window, a violent burst of light that seemed to fill the chamber from wall to wall. It wasn't just brightness, it was a living thing, moving too fast to understand. One of the younger engineers shouted for the emergency release, his voice cracking over the noise. Someone else reached for the valve wheel, hands trembling, but the hatch wouldn't open. The pressure inside the chamber had spiked, sealing it shut like a tomb. The difference between the internal and external atmosphere made it physically impossible to force the door. The wheel refused to turn, no matter how many hands tried. The oxygen-fed fire raged inside, feeding on every surface, while outside, helplessness. Seconds stretched. The sound from inside began to change, a heavy, rhythmic pounding that made the metal tremble. They knew what it meant. He was still conscious, still trying to get out. Someone shouted to equalize the pressure, but to do that, they had to vent the chamber, and that took time that no one had. There was shouting, movement, panic, but everything blurred together into a kind of slow-motion nightmare. The gauges rattled, the control lights flickered between red and white, and the mechanical hum of the oxygen system became unbearable. Every second felt like an accusation. Finally, the pressure needle began to drop. The air hissed out of the valves, the hatch shuddered, and for the first time, it loosened under their weight. When the door opened, the rush of air burst outward, hot and foul, carrying smoke that made their eyes sting instantly. They hesitated only for a moment before rushing in. The scene was almost beyond comprehension. The inside of the chamber was blackened, warped, and slick with melted insulation. The floor was covered in a thin film of soot, the smell sharp and metallic. Bondarenko was lying near the center, still breathing, his movements slow, deliberate, as if he were fighting to stay connected to the world. One of the medics dropped to his knees beside him, whispering words that no one could hear over the noise of the fans and the clatter of equipment being pushed aside. They lifted him out carefully, passing him down the corridor where the air was clearer, where light filtered through narrow windows. Someone ran ahead to call the ambulance. Another tried to cover him with a clean sheet, but it clung to his skin. The technician who had turned the valve stood frozen, unable to move, his hands still shaking. Outside, the siren started, distant, uncertain, as if even the world beyond the walls couldn't comprehend what had happened. The pine trees swayed in the cold wind again, the same as before, and yet everything had changed. Inside the facility, a handful of people stared at the empty chamber, the metal warped and silent, and understood, too late, that a few minutes of delay could divide history into before and after. And in those minutes, humanity's reach for the stars had come face to face with its own fragility. The ambulance drove through the night, its siren cutting the quiet streets like a blade through fabric. Moscow hospitals in 1961 were not built for this kind of emergency, not for the kind of injuries that belonged to laboratories, not battlefields. The doctors were waiting before the vehicle even stopped. They had been told almost nothing, just a name, a condition. A silence between the words that said more than any official explanation could. When they opened the doors, a gust of cold air mixed with the sterile smell of disinfectant and oxygen tanks. Bondarenko was conscious, barely, his face calm, his voice faint. He asked about the others, about the experiment, about whether it was still being recorded. The medics didn't answer. Some questions were too heavy to touch. They rushed him into the treatment room, cutting away what was left of his training suit. The wool had fused with skin in places, the fabric transformed into something almost metallic. Nurses moved around with quiet precision, their eyes focused but hollow. There was no panic here, only a grim rhythm of practiced motion. They knew what to do, even if they knew it might not be enough. For the next 16 hours, the hospital became its own universe, a place suspended between life and stillness. The corridors smelled of alcohol and gauze. Machines clicked softly in the background, marking time that felt irrelevant. Bondarenko drifted in and out of awareness. He tried to speak occasionally, but every word came out as a whisper, fragile and deliberate. One of the surgeons later said that he was remarkably calm, not resigned, not frightened, just quiet, as if he understood something no one else did. His pulse slowed, then steadied, then slowed again. The doctors fought to stabilize him, adjusting fluids, checking oxygen, exchanging looks that no one wanted to interpret. Outside the ward, the officials had already arrived. 2 men in gray suits waited in the corridor, smoking in silence. Their presence was heavy, not threatening, but inevitable. They didn't ask to see him, they didn't need to. One of them made a brief note in a leather notebook and left. Orders would come later. Reports would be written, sealed, and locked away. Inside, time moved differently. The nurses changed bandages, whispered to each other, avoided eye contact with the observers by the door. The smell of antiseptic clung to their uniforms. At one point, Bondarenko's hand twitched, just slightly, as if reaching for something. A reflex, maybe? Or maybe not. When the clock reached morning, the light outside had turned pale, almost white. Snowflakes drifted past the hospital windows, melting as they touched the glass. The city was waking up. Trams, footsteps, the usual hum of life, unaware that, within those walls, one of the brightest hopes of the Soviet space program was fading into history. The doctors did not announce anything. They simply stopped moving. The sound of the monitors went quiet, replaced by the mechanical hum of the ventilation system. In the silence that followed, there was no drama, no words, only the weight of inevitability. By noon, the corridor had been cleared. The files were taken away, the bed sheets replaced. To anyone passing by, it looked like an ordinary hospital room again. But those who had been there, the nurses, the surgeon, the technician who'd turned the valve the day before, carried something unspoken with them, something that would never fully fade. 16 hours. That's how long a man's will to live can fight against science, against physics, against fate. And in that quiet hospital on the edge of Moscow, it was a fight the world would not learn about for 25 years. The morning after the incident, the facility looked almost untouched. Workers returned to their stations, the corridors were washed, the scorched chamber sealed and marked under maintenance. There was no public announcement, no press briefing, no mention in the daily bulletins. The Soviet Union woke up that day as if nothing had happened, and perhaps that was the point. Within hours, a different kind of machinery began to turn, one made not of gears and pistons, but of silence. The officials from Moscow arrived before noon, their black Volgas lining the street outside like punctuation marks. Men in dark coats moved through the corridors, speaking in low voices, collecting notebooks, log sheets, and tapes. Every document that mentioned Bondarenko's name was gathered into a single gray folder and stamped classified. The engineers were questioned separately. Each was told the same thing. The details were not to leave the facility. What they saw, what they heard, what they felt, all of it would stay buried. Even to family, they were to say nothing. The death of a young cosmonaut trainee did not fit the narrative of a triumphant space program. The Soviet Union, after all, was about to send the first man into orbit. The story could not falter. Bondarenko's body was taken quietly from the hospital that same day. No public funeral, no ceremony, no farewell from his comrades. His parents were informed with a carefully worded telegram that mentioned only a training accident. The specifics were withheld, not out of cruelty, but out of policy. His name was removed from group photographs, his presence erased from rosters. It was as if he had never existed. In Star City, where the other cosmonauts trained, the news spread by whispers. They understood instantly what it meant, not just the danger, but the silence. If something went wrong, if any of them were lost, their stories would vanish too. The message was clear. Heroes existed only in victory. Anything less would be forgotten. One of the technicians, years later, would recall the eerie quiet of those days. It was like walking through a dream, he said. We cleaned everything, painted over the scorch marks, replaced the instruments. By the end of the week, it was as if the fire had never been. Officially, the incident never happened. There was no mention of it in internal reports, no trace in the archives accessible to the public. Even Yuri Gagarin, only weeks away from making history, was told little. To speak of Bondarenko was to invite questions no one dared to answer. But memory has its own persistence. Among the cosmonauts, his absence was a ghost that lingered, not in photos, but in the spaces between conversations. A shared understanding that progress had a price, and some names would never appear on medals or monuments. For 25 years, the secret held. The world celebrated Gagarin's smile, the rockets, the victories. And yet, beneath the brilliance of that era, there remained a shadow. One small, unmarked page in history, left blank by design. It was the silence that made it heavy. Not denial, not deceit, silence. The kind that governments use to protect glory, and the kind that human beings carry when they have seen too much. For more than 2 decades, Valentin Bondarenko's name existed only in whispers. The Soviet archives were sealed, the chamber rebuilt, the people who had seen the fire transferred, retired, or learned to forget. History had moved on, at least that's what everyone was told. But silence never lasts forever. In the mid-1980s, Moscow was changing. The rigid surface of secrecy began to crack under the weight of a new word that was suddenly everywhere: glasnost. The air of censorship that had lingered for generations was thinning, just enough for old memories to breathe again. It was during this fragile shift that one man decided to ask the question no one else dared to. His name was Yaroslav Golovanov. Golovanov wasn't an outsider. He was a respected journalist, a chronicler of the Soviet space triumphs, a man who had stood beside Gagarin, Titov, Tereshkova, someone trusted to tell the official version of history. But he had always been haunted by the gaps, by the rumors that circulated quietly among engineers and doctors. There was talk of an incident before Gagarin's flight, of a young man who had vanished from the training photographs. He began to search, cautiously at first. Old colleagues gave evasive answers, files were missing or marked top secret. One technician he tracked down refused to speak, only saying, "Don't open old wounds, Yaroslav. They won't thank you for it." But curiosity, once awakened, doesn't retreat. Golovanov followed every trace, every fragment of memory that had survived the machinery of erasure. It took years of patience and small acts of defiance. He spoke to retired medics, engineers who had worked on early cosmonaut tests, even cleaners who had worked in the facility. Piece by piece, the fragments aligned. A training chamber, oxygen, fire, a name: Bondarenko. When Golovanov finally published the story in 1986, it wasn't an exposé filled with outrage. It was quiet, precise, respectful, like a confession written for history itself. He described the young pilot, the accident, the secrecy that followed. There were no accusations, no politics, only facts wrapped in the kind of sorrow that truth always carries when it's told too late. The revelation spread quickly. Some readers doubted it. Others were stunned into silence. For the first time, the missing piece of the Soviet space story had a name and a face. Scientists who had once worked under strict orders of silence wrote letters of gratitude. "At least now he exists," one of them said. "He's no longer a ghost." Golovanov's report didn't rewrite history, it repaired it. It gave back a measure of dignity not only to Bondarenko, but to everyone who had risked their lives in those first uncertain years. The official institutions stayed quiet, of course. There were no apologies, no ceremonies. But within the community of cosmonauts, a kind of peace settled. The truth, after so many years underground, had finally surfaced. It was a small act in the grand scale of politics, but an enormous one for memory. One man's persistence had broken through the concrete of silence. Bondarenko's story could now breathe, could finally belong to the world, not as a rumor, not as propaganda, but as something achingly human. And in a way, it was fitting that it took another storyteller to rescue him from the shadows, a writer who understood that the history of space was not written only in triumphs, but in the quiet sacrifices that lit the path toward the stars. The tragedy of Bondarenko's accident didn't end in 1961. It lingered, invisible, woven into the DNA of every mission that followed. Engineers learned in silence, working under orders not to speak of what they knew. But knowledge, even forbidden knowledge, has a way of surviving. It seeps into designs, into unspoken cautions, into the cautious tightening of a valve before a test. In the years that followed, the Soviet space program continued with remarkable discipline. Gagarin flew, then Titov. The world saw glory, not grief. Yet within the laboratories, something had changed. A quiet wariness had taken root. The engineers no longer trusted oxygen the way they once had. They respected it, feared it, redesigned around it, but they never discussed why. Oxygen had been chosen for its simplicity, clean, pure, efficient. It was easy to manage in a sealed environment, provided you followed the rules. But the problem wasn't the chemistry, it was the arrogance. The belief that nature could be engineered into submission. Bondarenko's chamber had been built without the full understanding of what that purity meant, how, in a high-pressure environment, even materials that resisted flame could turn into fuel. After the fire, engineers began to test new materials in secret. Synthetic fibers, flame-resistant coatings, alternate atmosphere mixtures. They never cited the reason in official memos, but the impulse was clear: never again. And yet, history is cyclical. Across the ocean, in another country, a new generation of astronauts would one day face the same invisible danger, sealed in another capsule, surrounded by the same treacherous element. Safety, at its core, is not a set of procedures, but a philosophy. It demands humility, the understanding that even the smallest oversight can unravel the largest dream. But in the Cold War's feverish pursuit of supremacy, humility was a luxury no one could afford. Progress had to appear unstoppable. Accidents, if acknowledged, became ammunition for the enemy. And so silence was not just a policy, it was protection. For the technicians who had survived that day, the lesson was carved deep. They began to notice every potential hazard: a spark, a frayed cable, a flicker in a circuit. Their eyes grew sharper, their work slower, more deliberate. They no longer believed in perfection. Perfection was what had betrayed them. The irony was cruel. Bondarenko's loss improved safety for those who came after him, even if no one spoke his name. His story, erased from books and files, lived quietly in the reflexes of those who built the spacecraft that would carry others into orbit. It's tempting to believe that science advances through discovery, but sometimes it moves forward through mistakes, the kind that no one wants to admit. And in that silence, progress takes on a different shape. It becomes less about conquest and more about survival. Bondarenko's fire was not forgotten by the people who mattered most, the ones who turned wrenches, checked seals, tested pressure lines. They remembered, even if they could not say it aloud. Every time an engineer paused before a test and asked, "Is it safe?" that question, unspoken but persistent, carried the echo of a young pilot's last experiment. The lesson was there, buried but alive, that the pursuit of the stars demands not just courage, but caution, and that the smallest act of awareness, a single pause before pressing a switch, can be the difference between reaching the cosmos and being consumed by the very air that keeps us alive. Across the Atlantic, another nation was dreaming the same dream. By the mid-1960s, the United States was racing to the moon with an urgency that felt almost feverish. Every launch, every televised countdown was a declaration that progress could outpace tragedy, that space was humanity's next frontier, not its graveyard. Yet history, patient and exact, was waiting to repeat its lesson. On January 27, 1967, 6 years after the fire in the Soviet chamber, 3 American astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, stepped into the Apollo 1 command module at Cape Kennedy for what was supposed to be a simple plugs-out test. No flight, no danger, just a routine systems check in preparation for their mission to orbit Earth. The atmosphere inside the capsule, designed to mimic flight conditions, was filled with pure oxygen. No one questioned it. Pure oxygen had worked in Mercury and Gemini. Its simplified design, reduced weight, and matched the pressures astronauts would experience in space. But the Americans, like the Soviets before them, underestimated its appetite for chaos. Inside the capsule, the air was thick with potential energy. Every wire, every piece of Velcro, every layer of nylon carried a hidden risk. The astronauts joked as they strapped in, their voices easy over the radio. Technicians monitored data streams. The day felt ordinary, And then, suddenly, it didn't. A spark, perhaps from a wire, perhaps from friction, leapt unseen. In a heartbeat, fire tore through the cabin. The communications line filled with shouting, then static. The flames, feeding on the oxygen, raced across the interior faster than anyone could move. Outside, engineers scrambled for the hatch, but the inward opening design trapped the crew inside. Pressure rose instantly. The metal glowed. It was over in seconds. The fire consumed itself in the same way Bondarenko's had, with brutal, total efficiency. When the hatch finally gave way, the air that rushed out was hot enough to blister the skin of the rescuers. The men inside were still in their seats. The aftermath was a mirror image of the Soviet tragedy: disbelief, confusion, grief, and, for a brief moment, denial. But unlike the USSR, the United States had no machinery of silence powerful enough to bury it. The world saw the images, the smoke, the faces of three men who had embodied the nation's pride. The investigation began immediately, televised and unflinching. Every wire, every switch, every flammable material was examined, questioned, rethought. For NASA, it was the harshest of awakenings. They had believed in the same illusion, that progress could be controlled, engineered into submission. The Apollo program stopped. Designs were torn apart and rebuilt. The capsule atmosphere was changed, materials replaced, emergency systems reinvented. It took 21 months before astronauts flew again. And somewhere, in a quiet corner of Moscow, a handful of engineers who still remembered 1961 watched the news with heavy hearts. They knew the look in the Americans' eyes, the stunned recognition that technology, for all its brilliance, is never greater than its smallest flaw. They had learned it first. Now the lesson was global. The fire that began in a sealed Soviet chamber had crossed oceans and ideologies, carried not by politics but by physics. Two nations divided by secrecy and rivalry were suddenly bound by the same truth, that space, for all its wonder, is unforgiving. It demands perfection and punishes arrogance. In that way, Bondarenko and the Apollo 1 crew were connected, not by borders or flags, but by the thin line between ambition and catastrophe. Theirs were the warnings written in flame, spoken in silence, and remembered, if not always acknowledged, by those who followed. Two fires, two nations, two moments separated by 6 years, thousands of miles, and a wall of ideology, yet they burned with the same cause, the same arrogance, the same human blindness. History, it seems, doesn't shout when it repeats itself, it whispers. And too often, no one listens. The Soviet engineers had seen what oxygen could do. They knew the violence of its purity, the way it turned ordinary fabric into fuel and air into a weapon. But their lesson was buried under orders, stamped with silence, and sealed behind steel doors. By the time the Americans began preparing Apollo 1, that knowledge had vanished into classified archives and fearful memories. It's haunting to think that if Bondarenko's story had been told, if his name had not been erased, those 3 astronauts in Florida might have lived. The same atmospheric conditions, the same trapped hatch, the same helpless seconds. Different men, same outcome. The parallels were too sharp to ignore, yet for decades they existed in isolation, like reflections unaware of each other. After the Apollo 1 fire, NASA's investigation unearthed the same truths Soviet engineers had once whispered about. The environment inside the capsule was too volatile, the materials too flammable, the safety procedures too optimistic. There were memos written in both languages, Russian and English, echoing the same conclusions: pure oxygen kills too fast. But beyond the chemistry, the parallels were philosophical. Both nations had been racing not against each other, but against time, desperate to prove something cosmic about themselves. In that rush, they both forgot that technology, for all its brilliance, is still a creation of human hands, and human hands tremble. In Moscow, the tragedy had been suffocated by secrecy. In America, it was broadcast across the world. One was buried, the other dissected in public. Yet both were driven by the same engine, pride. The kind that builds rockets, but also blinds entire systems to the fragility of what they create. For those who lived through both eras, engineers who read foreign newspapers in secret, scientists who caught fragments of Western radio reports, the symmetry was unbearable. They didn't feel vindicated, they felt haunted. The same mistake, twice. Two sets of bright, ambitious men gone in the same way, under the same false assumption of safety. There's a kind of melancholy in realizing how universal failure is. The stars belonged to no one, yet both sides fought as if they could claim ownership. The cosmos didn't care about flags or languages. It cared only for precision, for respect, and when that respect was lacking, it answered with flame. The connection between Bondarenko and Apollo 1 became, over time, an unspoken bond. Engineers, historians, and astronauts would later speak of them together, not as separate accidents, but as chapters of one long, painful education. The lesson was not just about oxygen or design flaws, it was about humility. Both fires revealed the same truth, that space exploration was not a conquest, but a covenant, one that demanded awareness, restraint, and honesty. And in that sense, Bondarenko's silence and Apollo's cry were two halves of the same warning, echoing through time, trying once more to be heard. Every failure leaves behind a blueprint, not of the machine that broke, but of the assumptions that built it. After Apollo 1, after Bondarenko, engineers on both sides of the Iron Curtain were forced to confront what they had avoided for too long, the fact that ambition had outpaced understanding. In the dim glow of drafting rooms, men bent over new schematics, their pencils moving slower than before. The silence that filled those rooms was not the bureaucratic hush of secrecy, but the reflective kind, the quiet that follows grief. Mistakes had become data. Data became design. Design eventually became safety. NASA began by stripping everything down. The Apollo capsule, once praised as a masterpiece of precision, was rebuilt piece by piece. Engineers examined every cable, every coating, every bolt that could generate friction. Flammable Velcro was replaced with metallic fasteners. Synthetic fabrics gave way to flame-resistant beta cloth. The cabin atmosphere, once 100% oxygen, was changed to a safer nitrogen-oxygen mix during ground tests. The hatch, the one that had sealed the crew inside, was redesigned to open outward in under 10 seconds. Across the ocean, the Soviets were making their own quiet revolution. Without ever mentioning the name Bondarenko in official memos, they altered the composition of air inside their spacecraft, introduced fireproof insulation, and revised emergency protocols for every isolation experiment. Technicians began carrying pressure equalization tools, small, almost symbolic devices, reminders that they would never again face a sealed door they couldn't open. Engineers by nature think in systems. They don't often speak of morality, but their blueprints carry it nonetheless. Every redesign was a gesture of respect, every added safety layer an apology written in metal and wire. There was no ceremony, no monument, no eulogy, only process. That's how the space programs mourned, by improving. And yet, beneath the precision and the new procedures, there was an unease that refused to vanish. It wasn't just about preventing the next accident, it was about understanding why it had happened in the first place. How did so many smart, disciplined people fail to see what was right in front of them? How could the pursuit of perfection make them blind to imperfection? One engineer from the Apollo redesign team later said, "We stopped building spacecraft for heroes. We started building them for human beings." It was an acknowledgement that progress should never rely on invincibility. Space was not a stage for myth, it was a place that punished error without emotion. In the Soviet workshops, the sentiment was the same, even if unspoken. They knew that the line between courage and vulnerability was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. The young pilots who had once trained for glory were now training for survival. When the Apollo program resumed in 1968, and when Soviet cosmonauts continued to orbit Earth, every successful mission carried the fingerprints of the fallen. The air inside those capsules was safer, the materials less flammable, the escape routes clear. Progress, real progress, is not the absence of failure, it's the ability to learn from it without denial. The engineers on both sides had faced their worst nightmare and turned it into knowledge. And though their nations never exchanged a single word about it, their work spoke the same language, one written not in propaganda, but in lessons born of fire. History, like space, is selective. It remembers who it wants to, and it forgets quietly. In the race to the stars, remembrance became political currency, names, faces, and missions woven into the mythology of power. Success was paraded, sacrifice was hidden. What was remembered depended not on merit, but on narrative. In the United States, Apollo 1 became a national tragedy and, soon after, a national symbol. There were televised memorials, official investigations, and moments of silence in schools. The astronauts' names were etched into stone, their widows interviewed with reverence. The disaster was folded into the American story, not as failure, but as proof of resilience. They gave their lives so we could reach the moon, people said. And in a sense, it was true. The nation grieved publicly, visibly, cathartically. In the Soviet Union, grief was private, controlled, edited, redacted. Bondarenko's story was deemed unnecessary, even dangerous. To speak his name was to invite doubt into the myth of invincibility that surrounded the space program. The party needed heroes, not warnings. So his photograph was trimmed from group portraits, his uniform reassigned. The crater on the moon that would one day bear his name didn't exist on any map yet. It's strange how memory bends under pressure, just like metal. In America, tragedy was transformed into narrative strength. In the USSR, it was absorbed into silence. Both responses served their systems. But for the individuals, the engineers, the medics, the families, the silence and spectacle were equally hollow. The politics of space exploration was never just about rockets or science. It was about control, over image, over language, over the very idea of truth. Heroes were selected as carefully as the materials used in spacecraft. Their stories were polished, stripped of uncertainty, made fit for national pride. There was no room for the ordinary, for the unlucky, for the ones who faltered in the name of progress. Bondarenko was not the only one to vanish into that shadow. The Soviet archives hid others, pilots, scientists, prototypes of ambition that ended quietly. Their contributions lived on, but their humanity was deleted. Even after Glasnost, when journalists like Golovanov unearthed their stories, the official memorials remained strangely incomplete. A few names carved in stone, a few mentions in obscure corners of museums, fragments of truth scattered among monuments to victory. Across the world, at Cape Kennedy, a small plaque honored the crew of Apollo 1. Later, astronauts from Apollo 15 left a tiny metal figure on the moon, the fallen astronaut, accompanied by a plaque listing the names of those who had lost their lives in space exploration. But Bondarenko's name wasn't there, not because he didn't belong, but because his story had been buried too deep, locked behind borders and decades of denial. It's unsettling to realize how memory itself can be engineered. The same way spacecraft are built to withstand vacuum, history is built to withstand discomfort. Nations craft the version of remembrance they can live with, and discard what doesn't fit. Yet memory, like gravity, eventually pulls everything back. Time erodes propaganda, and names resurface. Some whispered first, some carved later. Bondarenko's story, once erased, began to reappear in quiet documentaries, in the footnotes of history books, in the voices of modern cosmonauts who speak his name without fear. Space exploration was supposed to make humanity look upward, but perhaps its most profound legacy lies in looking inward, in confronting not just how far we've gone, but who we've left behind in the shadows. Somewhere on the far side of the moon, beyond the reach of naked eyes and the glare of telescopes, there is a crater named Bondarenko. It's small, quiet, unremarkable compared to the great scars that mar the lunar surface. No flag stands near it, no footprints surround it. From Earth, it cannot be seen. And yet, in that silence, it says more than any monument ever could. The decision to name it came quietly, decades after the accident, long after the Soviet Union had fallen and the Cold War's noise had faded into nostalgia. There was no ceremony, no headlines, no official speeches. It appeared in a catalog published by the International Astronomical Union, almost as an afterthought, just one name among thousands. And still, it mattered. In a way, it was poetic justice. The man whose story had been buried beneath layers of secrecy now had his name inscribed where no censorship could reach it, on the moon itself, a place untouched by politics, unreachable by denial. There, among the frozen craters and endless night, Valentin Bondarenko found the recognition he had been denied on Earth. The irony is haunting. The Soviets never built him a statue. No parade ever honored him. His face didn't appear on stamps or coins. Yet a barren crater, a wound carved by impact long before humans existed, became his quiet memorial. It doesn't crumble, it doesn't age, and it doesn't need approval to exist. The moon remembers what nations forget. For astronomers, the name is just another coordinate in the cartography of space. But for those who know the story, it carries a different gravity. To trace a finger across the map and find Bondarenko is to acknowledge a life that was almost erased. A life that, despite being consumed in a sealed chamber, continues to orbit human memory in quiet persistence. It's hard not to imagine him there in a symbolic sense. The young pilot who once dreamed of flight, now resting eternally in the place where all dreams of flight eventually lead. The crater lies on the far side, forever hidden from Earth, just as his story was once hidden from the world. And maybe that too feels fitting, a final echo of the secrecy that defined his fate, transformed at last into something peaceful. Modern cosmonauts sometimes mention him now, not as a warning, but as a reminder. His name appears in training materials, in the quiet reverence of commemorative essays, in the private conversations of those who understand the cost of exploration. They speak of him as part of the foundation, not the mythic foundation of conquest, but the fragile one built on human error, courage, and consequence. When lunar maps list Bondarenko crater, they do so without fanfare. Just a name, a mark, a fact. But for those who look closely, it represents something much larger, the restoration of memory. Up there, in that cold silence, he finally belongs to no nation, no propaganda, no rivalry. He belongs only to space itself, and to the long chain of humanity's striving, where every triumph is shadowed by a loss, and every loss, in time, becomes part of the light that guides the next ascent. Silence, like vacuum, has its own pressure. It doesn't simply hide things, it reshakes them. The Soviet government's decision to bury Bondarenko's story was not just an act of censorship, it was an act of distortion. By erasing one man, they altered the narrative of an entire era. And in doing so, they robbed the world of something far more valuable than a name. They robbed it of perspective. For 25 years, the global story of space exploration was told as a contest of glory. The Soviet triumph of Gagarin, the American triumph of Armstrong. Each nation framed its journey as a string of flawless victories. There was no room for uncertainty, no room for tragedy that couldn't be spun into inspiration. But space, indifferent and vast, has no patience for myths. It exposes every flaw, in design, in politics, in human nature. If Bondarenko's death had been acknowledged in 1961, the world might have learned sooner. The lessons about oxygen, materials, and safety might have crossed borders before Apollo 1. The engineers who redesigned America's spacecraft could have studied a tragedy already written in another alphabet. Maybe the fire that took Grissom, White, and Chaffee could have been prevented. Maybe 3 lives could have been spared. But silence builds walls thicker than any ideology. The USSR's need to appear infallible was as blinding as America's need to appear first. And between those two ambitions, knowledge was trapped. Science thrives on transparency, the sharing of failure as much as success. But when failure becomes shame, learning stops. Even within the Soviet Union, the silence had consequences. Engineers couldn't publish safety papers. Doctors couldn't cite the case in medical journals. Students never studied the incident as part of aerospace safety courses. A generation grew up without knowing that progress had already claimed one of its own. And then there's the human cost, not in the numbers, but in memory. Bondarenko's parents were told almost nothing. His colleagues were forced to act as if he had never existed. They carried the knowledge privately, like contraband. Some of them lived long enough to see his story finally come to light in 1986. By then, the Cold War was fading, and truth was no longer treason. One of the engineers reportedly wept when he read Golovanov's article, whispering, "Now at least he's free." The tragedy of secrecy is that it freezes time. It traps the living in unfinished grief and denies the dead the dignity of remembrance. It also denies future generations the wisdom that comes from honest reflection. Every concealed truth becomes a delayed lesson, and delayed lessons in science cost lives. When nations compete in silence, they repeat each other's mistakes in different languages. The Bondarenko incident and the Apollo 1 fire were not isolated accidents. They were reflections of the same flaw in human thinking, the belief that perfection is more powerful than truth. The silence surrounding Bondarenko wasn't just the absence of words, it was the absence of mourning, accountability, and growth. And that absence rippled outward, shaping the way humanity told its own story of reaching the stars, triumphant but incomplete. Looking back now, it's hard not to wonder how much further we might have come, how much safer, wiser, more united our exploration could have been, if, from the very beginning, we had the courage to speak openly about failure, and to honor those who fell in pursuit of the infinite, not by hiding their stories, but by letting them teach us how to keep going. Every era of exploration carries its ghosts, but not all are mourned the same way. Bondarenko's silent sacrifice and the public grief of Apollo 1 formed twin pillars of a painful education. Out of those flames, one hidden, one broadcast, a new culture of safety slowly took root, stretching across borders even when politics refused to. By the early 1970s, both space programs had begun to evolve beyond ideology. The Soviet Union's engineers, hardened by quiet experience, continued to refine their systems with a precision that bordered on obsession. Air mixtures were balanced with mathematical care. New fabrics were designed to resist combustion. Every seal and gasket was tested again and again until failure itself seemed impossible, or at least more predictable. In the United States, NASA rebuilt its soul alongside its hardware. After the Apollo 1 investigation, engineers stopped thinking like dreamers and started thinking like skeptics. The new motto became implicit, whispered more than written. Nothing is safe until it proves itself dangerous. Every system was challenged, every assumption re-examined. The Apollo spacecraft that finally reached the moon was not only a triumph of human ambition, it was a monument to self-correction. And quietly, beneath the headlines of rivalry, something extraordinary began to happen. Both sides were learning from each other, even if they could never admit it. Soviet scientists read Western safety reports smuggled through academic exchanges. American analysts scrutinized grainy photos of Soyuz modules, searching for clues about Soviet redesigns. Out of mutual suspicion came a strange kind of collaboration, the kind born not of friendship, but of shared vulnerability. When Apollo 13 nearly ended in disaster in 1970, that shared experience of fear resurfaced. The explosion aboard the spacecraft reminded the world that no amount of engineering could fully tame space. But this time, the systems held. The oxygen tanks failed, and yet the crew survived. That was not luck. It was the product of every mistake that had come before, every loss that had forced designers to imagine the unimaginable. By the time the Soyuz and Apollo missions met in orbit in 1975, docking in the cold vacuum as cameras watched from Earth, there was an unspoken sense of atonement in that connection. The handshake between Stafford and Leonov symbolized more than détente. It marked the moment when two philosophies of progress, shaped by tragedy, finally touched. From then on, safety was no longer a national secret. It was a universal language. The Space Shuttle era, the Mir Station, the International Space Station, all of them carried systems born from the shared legacy of Bondarenko and Apollo 1. Flame-retardant materials, redundant circuits, rapid pressure release hatches. The fingerprints of the past were everywhere, invisible but essential. And yet, even with all the innovation, the culture of risk never truly disappeared. Engineers still debate, still argue, still test. They know what the early pioneers did not, that safety is not a static achievement, but a living discipline, one that must be constantly renewed, questioned, doubted. In the end, the evolution of space safety wasn't a triumph of technology, but of humility. Humanity learned, slowly, painfully, that courage without caution is not bravery but blindness. Bondarenko's quiet experiment and Apollo 1's televised inferno became the twin warnings that shaped everything after. Every time a spacecraft door seals shut and oxygen fills the cabin, every time a launch clock begins its final countdown, their presence lingers, unseen, unnamed, but never unfelt. Because progress in space, like progress on Earth, isn't measured only by how far we go, but by how well we remember why we almost didn't make it. The space race is often remembered in colors: silver rockets, white suits, red flags, and the blue curve of the Earth beneath them. But behind those vivid images were shades of gray, the kind that don't fit neatly into patriotic documentaries. The Cold War wasn't just a battle of ideologies, it was a struggle for narrative control, fought as much in laboratories as in headlines. And nowhere did that tension weigh heavier than on the men and women whose lives became fuel for progress. In both nations, scientists and cosmonauts were treated like instruments of destiny. Their courage was public, their fear private. They were told they were the front line of humanity, yet their realities were anything but heroic. The Americans faced cameras and congressional hearings. The Soviets faced secrecy and silence. The pressure was suffocating in both languages. In the Soviet Union, cosmonauts lived under an invisible lens of political expectation. Every smile was monitored, every phrase rehearsed. They were symbols first, humans second. Behind closed doors, they trained until exhaustion, their bodies pushed beyond what medical ethics might have allowed elsewhere. Failures were reclassified as technical delays. Injuries disappeared from records. Even minor mistakes carried the weight of betrayal, not just of their team, but of the motherland itself. In the United States, the atmosphere was freer, but the pressure was no less brutal. NASA was under constant scrutiny, from the press, from Congress, from the American public hungry for victory. Each test, each launch, each malfunction became front-page news. Engineers slept in their offices. Astronauts rehearsed interviews as carefully as they rehearsed flight sequences. When Apollo 1 burned, the grief was immediate and public, but it was also political. Every speech, every tear was measured against the next budget hearing. The Cold War demanded perfection, and perfection, by definition, leaves no room for error. That's why the mistakes were hidden, rewritten, or reframed as triumphs of learning. A system built on fear, of failure, of weakness, of losing face, breeds silence. And silence, as both superpowers learned, has a cost measured in human breath. Yet even in that tension, something unexpectedly human survived. Bonds formed between astronauts and cosmonauts, forged not by politics but by empathy. They recognized themselves in one another, the long hours in centrifuges, the smell of metal, the relentless fatigue. When the Apollo-Soyuz mission finally joined the two programs in 1975, the handshake between Alexei Leonov and Thomas Stafford wasn't just a diplomatic gesture, it was a moment of collective exhale. A quiet acknowledgement that, for all the noise and paranoia, they had been fighting the same fight, not against each other, but against the void. In the shadow of nuclear threat, space exploration became humanity's paradox, a pursuit of peace built by the machinery of war. Rockets designed to deliver weapons became vessels of hope. Propaganda turned into inspiration. But beneath the polished triumphs, the individuals, men like Bondarenko, engineers who couldn't speak, doctors who watched in silence, carried the unseen burden of that paradox. The Cold War eventually ended, but its echo lingers in every headline about exploration, every debate about budgets, every whispered story of what was hidden and why. The secrecy that once protected nations also stunted them. It made heroes disposable and truth negotiable. Now, decades later, when we look at those grainy photographs of smiling astronauts, it's easy to forget the shadows just outside the frame. The quiet, obedient figures who didn't make it into the picture. They were casualties of ambition, yes, but also of politics. The Cold War launched humanity into space, but it also trapped it in its own orbit, circling endlessly around pride, fear, and the fragile illusion of control. And perhaps, when we finally learn to look past those borders, to see space not as a battlefield but as a shared horizon, it wasn't just science that advanced, it was conscience. History rarely apologizes. It tends to move forward with the arrogance of inevitability, sweeping away the quiet, unglamorous figures who made its momentum possible. But sometimes, years later, it looks back, not out of guilt, but out of recognition. That's how the world began, slowly and awkwardly, to rediscover the people it had buried beneath silence. In the decades after the Cold War, as archives opened and journalists began sifting through classified files, forgotten names started to reappear. Men and women whose stories had been reduced to footnotes, whose photographs had been cropped out, whose families had been told to keep quiet. Valentin Bondarenko was one of the first to step back into history's light. When his story resurfaced in 1986, it didn't arrive with fanfare or official endorsement. It slipped quietly through newspapers and foreign broadcasts, reaching people who had never heard his name. For those who had, the engineers, the nurses, the friends who remembered the day of the fire, it was like seeing a ghost recognized at last. He existed, one of them said. Finally, the world knows he existed. Recognition doesn't undo injustice, but it heals something deeper, the wound of being erased. Over the years, Bondarenko's story became part of the unofficial lore of spaceflight, passed on by teachers, enthusiasts, and historians who understood that truth doesn't need permission to endure. His face returned to photographs. His name was restored to training records. For the first time, the Soviet and later Russian space community could speak about him openly, without fear. He was no longer a rumor. He became a reminder. And he was not alone. Across the world, other names emerged from obscurity. Technicians who died testing rockets, pilots lost in prototype capsules, engineers who sacrificed safety for deadlines. Each revelation reshaped the story of space exploration, turning it from a tale of national glory into something profoundly human. The narrative stopped being about perfection and became about perseverance. Modern astronauts, Russian, American, European, Chinese, began to carry those memories with them. They placed photographs of early pioneers inside the International Space Station. They mentioned their names in interviews. They carried their legacies not as burdens, but as compass points. Because without them, there would be no safety checklists, no flame-retardant fabrics, no emergency drills. The ghosts became guardians. There's something powerful in that reclamation, the act of remembering, not the flawless, but the fallible. It restores a sense of balance. It reminds us that progress is not built only on success, but on the quiet courage of those who face the unknown without promise of glory. When cosmonauts today train in pressurized suits, they do so in facilities that bear plaques to those who never made it into orbit. There's one in Star City with Bondarenko's name now, simple and modest. No marble, no grandeur, just a reminder that the path to the stars was paved by hands, by hearts, by risks that couldn't be measured in data. Reclaiming forgotten heroes isn't just about rewriting history, it's about reclaiming honesty. It's about looking back at humanity's greatest achievements and acknowledging the cost, not to diminish them, but to make them whole. And somewhere, between the official timelines and the private memories, a quiet truth settles. We move forward best when we remember who paid for our forward motion. The forgotten are never truly lost. They wait, in silence, in craters, in archives, until the world is finally ready to listen. For all the mathematics, the machinery, the algorithms, and the cold precision of engineering, space exploration has always been, at its core, a human story. Every mission, every countdown, every photograph of a planet seen for the first time carries traces of the people who built the road to that moment, the ones whose names are celebrated, and the ones who vanished into silence. We often talk about the cosmos as something beyond us, something unreachable and immense, but the truth is that space has always been a mirror. In its emptiness, it reflects everything that defines us: ambition, fear, brilliance, arrogance, love, and loss. It exposes our finest qualities and our worst instincts, sometimes in the same heartbeat. When you look at the faces of the early pioneers, Gagarin smiling under the weight of the world's expectations, Armstrong staring at the moon's surface through the small window of the Eagle, the engineers standing behind glass walls in mission control, eyes fixed on blinking monitors, you realize that every one of them was, in some way, haunted, not by failure, but by understanding. They knew what it took to get there. They knew who wasn't standing beside them anymore. When you look at the faces of the early pioneers, Gagarin smiling under the weight of the world's expectations, Armstrong staring at the moon's surface through the small window of the Eagle, the engineers standing behind glass walls in mission control, eyes fixed on blinking monitors, you realize that every one of them was, in some way, haunted, not by failure, but by understanding. They knew what it took to get there. They knew who wasn't standing beside them anymore. The story of Valentin Bondarenko is not just a tragedy. It's a reminder that space exploration was never a clean narrative of triumph. It was, and still is, an experiment in what it means to be human when everything familiar is stripped away. He represents the vulnerability behind the helmets, the fragility hidden beneath layers of steel and protocol. In a sense, Bondarenko and the Apollo 1 crew share the same expression, the quiet, determined look of people who believed in something larger than themselves. They didn't see space as conquest, they saw it as continuity, a way to push the boundary of human experience just a little farther into the unknown. Their loss, quiet or public, forced the world to pause and ask not just how we explore, but why. And the answer, strangely enough, has always been emotional, not scientific. We go because curiosity is stitched into our DNA. We go because the sky refuses to stop calling. We go because, even after the fires and the failures, we still believe that the stars are not just distant lights, but destinations, mirrors of our persistence. The human face of space exploration isn't flawless. It sweats, doubts, dreams, and trembles. It makes mistakes and pays for them, but it also endures. Every launch that lights the night sky carries within it the ghosts of every test gone wrong, every name whispered only in training halls, every story almost forgotten. In the end, the greatest monument to those who gave everything for this pursuit isn't carved in stone or orbiting above the Earth. It's in the way humanity keeps looking up, despite everything. It's in the way we still gather to watch rockets rise, still hold our breath as they vanish into the black, still feel that small electric thrill when we see the pale curve of our planet against the dark. Because no matter how far we go, every journey begins and ends with people. With fragile, determined, hopeful beings who look at the void and decide that it isn't enough to stare. They must cross it. And in that decision, in that quiet defiance of gravity and fear, lives the true face of space exploration. Not steel, not flame, not perfection, just humanity, stubborn, flawed, and endlessly reaching for the stars.